Thanks, Laskin. Minister, I'm sure like me, you've been out knocking on doors in Dublin Central and Galway West over the past number of weeks, and one of the things I've been really struck about in the many conversations I've had with voters is the deep connection that people across our country feel with nature. And I think that connection applies irrespective of where people live, be it in urban or rural communities. And whether people are planting trees along streets in Stoneybatter or growing the land area that's protected by the Connemara National Park, people across Ireland want to see action taken to protect the nature which is around them. And indeed, many Irish people are actually taking that action themselves. And we just look at how communities around the country have embraced the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. Everywhere here we see the signs on roadsides and in parks, seeing that areas have been left aside and allowed to go wild. And this scheme has very much been driven forward by the Tidy Towns groups around the country. And I think the Tidy Towns movement itself has changed and evolved in many ways over the last number of years. Once was a time when the local clean-up basically involved a war on weeds. Now the local Tidy Towns groups are very much making space for nature, for wildness, for a bit of messiness within towns and villages. Community gardens, local authority allotments, the slow food movement, seed savers, each of these are manifestations of communities' desire to get closer to nature. And that passion has to be matched with government action and with government funding. In 2019, the Dáil declared a biodiversity crisis in Ireland alongside the climate crisis, and the Dáil recognised that the two were deeply interlinked. But right now, Ireland sits 13th from the bottom of countries worldwide in a biodiversity intactness index. And maybe this is unsurprising when we consider that Ireland spends the lowest relative amount among all EU member states on nature. My own colleague, Senator Malcolm Noonan, he said a reframe is needed when it comes to nature, that it actually should be treated as a piece of critical infrastructure in its own right. And what this government fails to see is that link between our future financial sustainability and our environmental sustainability. And it needs to shift its thinking towards one of investment in flood prevention, resilience in our farming system, community well-being, restoring our rivers, abundant seas, and cooling our urban centres. And that reframe should mean that this and future governments don't view nature restoration as a financial burden. Since last year, I've raised the status of Ladies Island Lake in Wexford in the Dáil on a number of occasions. And last weekend, the Climate Committee travelled to Wexford to see the condition of the lake. And as I acknowledged in the Dáil earlier this afternoon, an initial tranche of funding provided has allowed baseline and scoping work to begin there. And Ladies Island Lake could actually become a beacon for nature restoration across this island, but it will require the state to step up with more funding and support actions on the ground that will actually turn the story there around. It is worth reflecting that the biggest potential source of funding for restoring nature, and particularly for paying farmers for actions they agreed to undertake on their own land, that's now gone with the raiding of the Climate and Nature Fund last year by the government to plug holes in its existing infrastructure funding. There were hundreds of millions of euro put aside in the Climate and Nature Fund, money taken from the annual surpluses which were available to create new revenue streams, particularly for smaller farmers on marginal land. Minister, where are we going to replace that money that your government took out of the Climate and Nature Fund that would have financed nature restoration? So much of the rest of what you and your government's statements on nature protection hangs on that question of where that money is going to come from. And unfortunately, until the government can demonstrate a clear funding source for the scale of nature protection we need to address the interlinked nature and biodiversity crisis, pretty much everything that the government's reps say today rings hollow.